page, the third to last, like Socrates starts talking, it really reminds me of 1 Corinthians 13, where at the end he talks about, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And just the idea that, like, kind of talk about how, like, they're like us, because they are, like, right now we do see, but in a mirror dimly. It's like the shadow, the reflection. But then how him are wrestling through what would it be like when we do see face to face, and how we respond to that.
Others.
Listening to your description of this sounds like you're doing a review of the movie The Matrix, because that's what it is.
All about the Matrix.
And the age of billions, billions of people living their lives oblivious to the world that's been pulled over their eyes. And so the question is, because I don't know Plato's works, does he later give a suggestion of what that is, or not? Because he's saying here, there's this world. Does he later make a guess himself?
He does. He has a fairly elaborated idea of what this is. And in the Republic, he focuses mostly on his famous notion of the forms, and how there are these ideals out there in the spiritual world, wherever they are for Plato, that are giving, they're animating reality, but in a way that's seen and experienced imperfectly. And so that part of the task for Plato is achieving a mental discipline in order to access those forms, so that as an individual can have a more direct experience.
Piggyback on that, since this idea will become important, maybe we should introduce the idea of forms. The way I usually introduce it in my classes is you have an idea of the color red, right? But when you're first learning it as a child, you see examples of it, like that shirt is red, or I picked a bad example, my computer is red.
Right.
But later on you realize, oh, red doesn't mean computer or shirt. We can abstract that idea out, and it's something that exists in our mental world as well as in the physical world. Socrates is going to go on to argue that goodness is something we see examples of in this world, but it also exists as an ideal in this world of forms and ideas. And similarly with justice and beauty. And some modern thinkers would argue that those things are relative. For Socrates, they are not. Just like in this world, you may have someone who's colorblind. That's a defect in the way that they see the world. So people who see justice differently have a spiritual colorblindness, if you will.
We've heard that comment often when somebody is in disagreement with the reality, aren't you being colorblind?
Yeah.
So doesn't Christ bring up, Christianity bring up exactly what you were saying in the end?
Again, it's a remarkable point to
it invites you to your epiphany of what's out there for you to develop yourself in a frame that is nurturing to you, the individual. That's the best way I could say it.
At the risk of renewing my ignorance, when did Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, when were they?
Socrates dies in 399.
BC?
Yes.
Okay.
Plato is writing for the next 50 years, roughly.
So do we have any information on whether they were familiar with Hebrew scriptures and stuff?
This is exactly what Justin Martyr argues. I mean, he has no direct evidence, but and Augustine suggests they must have had access to the Hebrew prophets and the Mosaic Law because it's just too similar. I mean, there were later Christian thinkers who rejected that entirely, thought it was ridiculous, but that was how they were trying to grab. How can this be so close in some ways without some familiarity?
But there's never any direct...
Total conjecture. There's not a single quote that would suggest personal familiarity.
How much time elapsed from Plato writing his first manuscript to then being copied? And
Dispersed.
yeah.
Publication is an interesting issue in that world because obviously you don't have mechanical means of it. it was first written on wax tablets, and then once you had the final form you wanted, you would write it on something like papyrus. And immediately people would probably start copying it. But by the Alexandrian period, you have various versions, so people are starting to collect those and collate and see what the authentic version is.
So a couple hundred years.
I'm imagining that it was probably copied the day after it was written as well. Does that answer your?
Yeah, thank you.
Let's have a short
Brett,
comment.
in the back.
Yeah, you had asked the question, what is striking to Christianity? What struck me the most is on the second page, second to last statement by Socrates. Where Socrates asked, and for anyone who's speaking of the prisoners, if somebody came to try and rescue the prisoners and lead them to freedom, if they could somehow get their hands on him, wouldn't they kill him? And what did we do to Jesus?
Yeah.
And that, I mean, this is almost, Hebraic prophecy, and that's a little overinterpreted, but it's quite, very, very striking at least.
It's a great observation, and you can push it a little further, because this is a very incarnational story. Right? The argument is basically, hey, unless somebody has gone and actually has the experience of reality, and then comes back and interacts with the people in the human condition, there's no escape for them. I mean, it's strikingly similar to the notion of, well, a God-man, why is that necessary? Well, it's exactly necessary for this reason. A person of holiness who understands holiness and divinity in its fullness, in its most intimate sense, then coming and interacting with those who can't possibly know it on their own in order to liberate them. It's remarkable. It's a great description of incarnational theology.
Yeah, I have a question. I hope I'm not going ahead of the discussion, but since this predates like the apostles' teaching, I'm wondering whether apostles like Paul, who seems to be educated in Greek, philosophy and things like that, whether he was familiar with this and whether that may have influenced the way he preached to people who probably were familiar with this. Any evidence of that?
It's quite possible, yes. We do have Paul quoting other Greek authors. To my knowledge, he does not have any direct quotations from Plato, but it's very probable that he's familiar with it.
Now, I just say it's hard to imagine he would not have been familiar with Platonic thinking. Just the fact that the Greek authors he does quote are, relatively speaking, in this age, less canonical, if you will. His schooling must involve a fair amount of connection with classical authors. I think that's fair to say.
This is more a comment on that other question. I remember a pastor, Tim Tennant, talking about how, and I know Luke in his book of Acts used a similar principle or technique, because when he spoke about Paul going before the council at Athens, he structured it to draw parallels with the story of Socrates being tried in the same manner. So I know at least Luke used a similar technique, because he knew they would be familiar with it. Sort of saying that Socrates was on to something, I think was the pastor's argument, and that Luke is showing that Paul has an answer to Socrates' questions.
Well, I guess what I was asking is kind of, is it possible that his knowledge of this may have influenced how it's kind of described in like epistles, for example, you're writing to Greek audiences? Is it possible that you kind of use the language light, darkness, the other world you don't see, that kind of stuff? Is it possible that that's where that syntax might come from, so to speak?
I'm going to hear what Laura was saying. I'd say absolutely. It's striking to me how willing New Testament authors are to borrow well-worked Greek terms and then really reinvent them within a Christian framework. I mean, most famously, Logos. There's hundreds of years of philosophical writing on the notion of the word in Greek philosophy. And when John invokes that in John 1, it's a very bold move. because he's essentially saying, you're onto something, but now let me reinterpret this for you in a way that it's closer to reality. And I think they're doing that a little bit with Plato as well.
Yeah, I think the model for the New Testament writers is not complete separation from their culture, but using that to explain the gospel in a way that's understandable by their culture. I know you had a hand up for a long time.
Oh, yeah, I was struck by that comment, just about Jesus and the incarnation, and then, this like resonance with his death, and I think that's extended on the third page of the dialogue. Socrates' second speech. He was speaking of how this sounds like foolishness, and if the person kind of speaking of this new conception of truth is compelled to testify in court, he will look like a fool. And I found that quite an ominous subtext, that for the person who's articulating this new vision of what beauty and truth is, they will be called to account, and they will be called foolish in the eyes of the world.
Can I just say, a quick comment? I've been reading Hinges of History by Cahill. Are you familiar with those? And the third character, which I verified my neighbor, is Alexander the Great.